Oh, hi everybody. It's Charles again on the Burning Desire Show podcast. It's been some time, but we're going to get onto a bit of a more of a role. And today I'm really kind of pleased to bring on Chinazom Nwabueze. I hope I pronounced that closely correct. I don't know. We tried in the warm up, and I think I got it better then than now. But hey ho,
Yeah,
welcome anyway.
thank you so much, Charles. And yeah, it was good enough, the pronunciation. I'm really glad to be here and yeah, excited to have this conversation with you.
Great, great. So, people that watch or listen kind of know my general way of doing things, and we talked roughly about this. But I always like to understand. It goes back to the Steve Jobs quote, and I must have quoted this like 55 million times. But you cannot connect dots going forwards, only backwards. So, in other words, if you look at what you do now, which we'll clearly come on to, if you look at all the things you did previously, it makes sense as to how you got to where you are, both geographically, but also professionally and personally.
Mhm.
But if you'd have said that to yourself 15 years ago when you were doing something totally different, you probably would have said to someone, "You're talking nonsense. There's no way that's going to be me," I imagine.
Yeah. Well, definitely if I went back 15 years and said I was doing what I'm doing now, I'll tell you you were talking nonsense.
Yeah.
So I started in investment banking, studied economics, and I was doing that for 20 plus years at the time. And I just went through, like, I call myself Mr. Transition now. So it was from the moment I met my wife. Just prior to then, I'd started asking myself questions. What do I want to do in my career? There needs to be something more. And I stumbled onto something called sports psychology. So I started studying that, and I got to practice with like track and field athletes through this guy. And my wife kind of challenged me that you love doing this so much. Why don't you give it a go? So with a blessing from her, I decided to leave my job. I started doing it, and then we would then look into to move to the US. So my wife grew up in the US, and I made a mistake of bringing her to the UK in the middle of winter from Nigeria, which was a mistake I could never ever fix. So she didn't like the weather in the UK. So we started looking at the US, and then she was pregnant with our son at the time. So we kind of forced the decision of like, okay, if we're going to do it, we need to do it now. So I ended up moving with my 6 month pregnant wife to the US, just starting a career in performance psychology. And yeah, then when we got here, I had to really start practicing what I preach because I had to use the tools on myself because it was just as transitions go, you can plan it, but when you actually get to doing it in reality, it was tough and challenging. And then throw into that, the pandemic happened. So it was definitely having to adapt and pivot and
So,
change.
so just reversing a bit. So, I always like to understand. So, were you all at school? Like we're talking, like when you were a teenager, whatever. Was it always the finance economic route? Was it based on interest, or was it based on you saw that was where there was money and I wanted to do well type thing?
Oh, it was definitely survival. So I came over with my mum from Nigeria.
Right.
So when we came over, my mum was the only breadwinner for the family. So it was always ingrained in me that you need to be able to survive. So we needed to get a foot in. So I was just, and also growing up in Nigeria, when you're younger, you're either a lawyer, a doctor, or an engineer.
And
So you
how
kind
old
of
were you when you moved from Nigeria to the UK?
I was 14 when I came
Oh wow,
over.
so quite you got a good experience of living there, not just like a couple of years when you're really young.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I definitely started secondary school, I think, by the time I came over.
So just flipping around, so you've lived that amount of time, 14 years in Nigeria.
Yeah.
How many years? 20 or so in the UK?
25, 26,
And then
maybe so.
obviously
And then,
recently in the US the last couple of years.
yeah, US, I came 2019. So I've been about 4 years in the US. So
So
yeah, three transitions.
that's three very well, UK, US people think are very similar, but actually, if you spend any time, you realize they're not similar in the
They're
slightest.
not at all. You think you speak the same English, but people struggle to understand me locally where I live. Like when I used to go to the grocery store, I would have to go with my wife sometimes because I'd be asking for stuff and people just be looking at me like I'm speaking a foreign language. And then she would say it and they'll be like, "Oh, he wants the oatmeal or he wants something." I'm like, Jesus Christ.
So is she also from Nigeria, but she a US citizen or something? Is that was I get that
Yeah,
right?
she grew up in the US, but
Right.
also from Nigeria like myself. But
Okay.
she came over when she was a lot younger.
And how come how did you end up meeting just in the UK out of curiosity?
We met in Nigeria. So she moved back to Nigeria and she was living there. And I used to go and visit my dad every year. So this was
Got it.
one of those visits. But my mum came back with me. So I was taking my mum to go and see a family friend. And that family friend also is a family friend of my wife. And yeah, we
Aha.
met. Yeah.
Right. So then just going back to the chronology. So you purely out of, this was going to be a good profession and, financially it would put you in a good footing. You went into investment banking. And for people that don't know, like because everyone hears the term and they maybe see Wolf of Wall Street and they see certain things, but like, what does that actually mean? What were you doing day to day? What sort of thing? I'm sure you did lots of different roles, but as a general.
Yeah. So I wasn't doing Wolf of Wall Street. So I went into what I call financial risk managing. So I was working on, I don't want to put people to sleep, but collateralized investment. So it's where different banks bring their money together and they pool the money, and then somebody kind of manages that money and say, okay, where's it being invested in, reporting on it. So it's where the banks invest their money. So I was doing like financial reporting, doing all these calculations of cash flow modeling, that kind of stuff.
The
But usually,
Excel spreadsheet heavy and all these things.
yeah, Excel spreadsheet and cutting and pasting on PowerPoints to
And
present what.
is that, as when you're in it, I guess you don't realize it so much, but is that as soul destroying as it sounds?
It's not. It's just after you've been doing it for 20 years, then it becomes. So in the beginning, I did used to really enjoy it. And I won't lie, like during the financial crisis, working in the areas working where you get given a lot of responsibility and you're kind of a relationship manager, I love that part. Like the people I used to work with, trying to then understand, okay, this is what this structure is supposed to do. This is why you put it together. If something bad happens, this kicks in. So actually getting to understand that part was really interesting. I think it was just wanting to change, because after 20 years, it does become a bit more, then it starts to become a bit repetitive. And then you're not really learning as much. You're more kind of dealing with the politics of managing different stakeholders and people.
Yeah. So you do this 20-year career in investment banking. So you would say on the whole, you enjoyed that period of time. You don't resent doing that by any stretch.
Definitely didn't resent it. And it gave me financial freedom. So I'm never gonna
Okay.
like that. Yeah.
And so then you did briefly mention in passing, you met your wife, and at that point, where does the switch go from, I'm in doing financially very secure, I've got this great job, and now all of a sudden I'm going to do something else? Was it alongside? Like, how did you go into this?
It was just before I think I started doing some soul searching. So I used to always blame it on my wife, but actually my wife pointed out to me I was already doing the change before she met me.
Right.
I think I just used to ask myself questions of, I felt like the environments I was working in were not conducive to who I was as a person.
Okay.
And then I started asking myself, there's got to be a bit more that I want to do in my career. And that's when I went to something called Career Shifters. And then he kind of told me the things you're really passionate about, that you talk about all the time, is sports. And then someone who I really respected in her career, she was a psychotherapist. So I kind of realized, I also really like psychology. I didn't know the two were even could go together. By the time I started with that. So I was already going through a transition where I started doing a course while I was working just to test it out. Do I really like this? I did. And then I started doing a master's while I was working. And that was around the time when I met my wife, where I was just starting to ask myself questions of, okay, I need to take I need to take more risks.
Wait, hold on. It's like, oh God. Sorry. Don't know what happened. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Sorry, I just pressed the button on my computer and I just missed what you just said. So I got to, I think it might actually be on the, people can hear it, but I missed it. Okay. You were saying that you went to this Career Shifters. They mentioned, can you talk about what that is? Because that's quite interesting. What is that?
Career Shifters at the time, so this is going back 7 or 8 years. It was a company that just set up where, do you want more from your career? Do you want to find more passion in your career, or more purpose in what you're doing? And it was a friend who, she was a lawyer at the time, and she was also trying to like get out of her profession. So she said, why don't we go to that one evening?
Do you think this happens at a certain period in your life where you've got the financial security and then you go, want more? Do you think that's what happened, or just the amount of time you'd spent in it and just coming to the realization that it's not fulfilling something?
I think it's a bit of both. I think it's like you keep working and working for something and you're trying to rise up the career thing. Then you get the financial security, and then you kind of realize that, okay, well, that wasn't the answer. I still feel like there's something missing. Yeah. And they usually, yeah, it usually comes with after you've been doing it for 15, getting to 20 years, you start to ask yourself that question, is this really, yeah, what I want to do for the rest of my life?
It's
So,
interesting because I always retell a story of when I was fortunate that my grandfather was very successful, but you don't realize these things when you're growing up, of course. And he lived over in the States half the year in Boca Raton, which is like Florida way. And
mhm.
one of the people I used to play golf, so I used to meet different people, different age groups. And one of the guys was relaying a story where basically he's probably in his 80s, and he's like, for 50 years I was an attorney or for UK people, lawyer, whatever, and I hated every minute of it. In the last 2 or 3 years, it's some business, some lifestyle business in the Bahamas or whatever it was. I was like, I can't believe we're 50 years of my life. And it hit, I don't realize it. I was probably 12, 13 at the time, what that even meant. But then slowly, as you get older, you go, wow, that's actually that's a
That's
lot of
a long
people,
time.
unfortunately. So
Yeah.
you go to this career shifters event, and is it number of events? Like how did it work back then? What was it?
There's a number of events, but I just went to one.
Right,
And what I took away from the exercise was that this is something I'm passionate about, which is sports.
right.
And also the other question was who do you respect, who has their career? And it was this friend who, when we used to go on holiday, she would take her books to read on the beach. And I was like, who the hell does that? And then I realized, okay, whenever she talked about her job, I realized I enjoyed psychology. I enjoyed like understanding the way people think. So I
Hmm.
went away with that, and then that was enough for me to kind of, it sowed the seed about, okay, let me see how could I make a career out of those two things.
Okay. And so what surely taking that actual thinking it's one thing. I think a lot of people think these things and they go, yeah, I'd love to do something else, but actually taking that decision to go from what I imagine was a very lucrative career and go, I'm going to just jump into the unknown.
Yeah.
How did that pan out? From the
Well,
realization, what was the time frame from the realization of, okay, not do what I want to do. I want to do something in psychology. I'm passionate about that, and I want to do something in sports type thing.
yeah.
That come to be.
It probably started around 2014, where I'd started contracting. So I kind of left my permanent job, and the
Okay.
contracting gave me a bit more free time. And then I started like doing courses. So I did a course to certification in financial risk management. And then I realized I really just loved the learning part. So I was like, okay, there's got to be a bit more that I need to do myself. And then I think at the time after the end of the course, that's when I went to the career shifters. So I was like, okay, you're going to have to keep learning to find out what it is that you want. So I was already practicing. So I found out this sports psychology thing. I found the diploma. I did that. Okay, I did enjoy doing that. And then I found the master's. So I was raising that bit where you need to start doing something different to find out what it is.
Yeah.
And I was doing a lot of soul searching at the time. And I kind of realized something you just said, where people just do the career and they never ask themselves the question, is this what I really want to do? And at one point, I was like looking at myself in the mirror, thinking, I knew I wanted to have a family, but I knew I didn't want to be one of those dads that hated my job. And because I hate my job, I'll start saying the excuse, oh, I'm just doing it for my family to put food on the table, because then I knew that would be a lie. So I was like, I'd rather try something. If it didn't work out, at least I know I tried it. So at that point, I was like, okay, before the family comes, like if you're gonna take those risks, do it now, and then make sure you've given your all to it, so that if it doesn't work out, you're not going to later on start regretting, oh, what if I'd done
Did
that, done.
did your family and friends question your decision and go, hey, you've got this great career, you're jeopardizing it, what you're doing, or they were supportive, or
Um, Friends probably didn't say too much to me. They did think it was a bit crazy where I'd been Mr. Steady, as they used to call me, like doing the same career for 20 years and then all of a sudden deciding to just flip and do something else. My mum did think I was a bit crazy. She kept like asking me, why are you doing this? Are you sure it's the right decision? So I suppose having my wife in my corner, where she just kept like, challenging me that if you really like it, why don't you just go for it and take that risk? So she kind of supported me all the way through. So that I think that's what gave me that confidence to think, all right, let me go for it and see what happens.
and what did that physically look like? Was there just again, was it side by side? You studied it, but when did you actually turn from the contracting in the financial world to right, I'm going to, do this fully, and when did it start working for you?
It was actually, there was a moment I can remember where, so I was starting to go to like, joining different organizations, and there was a particular organization called ENIS back in, when I was in the UK. They were European Young Sports Psychology. So they used to give you a platform to go and present. So I did the first presentation. I really, really loved it. And then I did a workshop, and that one I really, really loved. And I remember at the end, my wife could see that. She was like, look at how you're literally buzzing afterwards, and you're so, passionate and energetic from it. Then she asked me a question: what would it take for you to make a career about this? And then I started thinking, and then I told her that, I'd have to be willing to keep learning, keep getting, as I said, getting my ass handed to me, because I'll be trying new things. And I'd also have to really want to communicate, because no one knew what it was, what performance psychology was, or sports psychology. So I'd have to be getting up and speaking in front of people, something which really scared me at the time. But when I said it to her, she said, okay, are you prepared to do that? And I was like, and I said, yeah. And I kind of shocked myself when I said it, because I'd be doing a career where I'd never be an expert. I would always be learning, and there was no charted way for success. So at that point, I think having that conversation with her, the question she asked me, I kind of decided, okay, it's time to just go for it. And then my contract ended at the time, and I just decided, okay, do that full time. So I was doing it for a year. It was definitely challenging trying to find clients. It was probably tougher than I expected.
Yeah, how did that work? Because I think a lot of people that want to start a business or an endeavor, it's all well and good doing the studying and getting yourself into gear, but that first client, like you haven't got any, any history or testimonials or anything to go on, Did you let them know they're your first client and go, look, I'm new to this, let me see? How did you like approach that? And where did you find them from?
The first one was I was already working with a guy who was a coach, and he used to work with track and field athletes. And while I was studying, he would let me just come and shadow and I talk with him, and he gave me my first clients. And then from there, I think I got my first six clients. Then from there, I decided.
And they're all sports people, are they?
They're all sports people.
And what? And can you give us an idea of what are they? Because again, this is something people don't know about very much about what sports psychology is. Like I think you see it a lot, or from me because I'm a big golf fan. Like in golf, it's a huge thing now.
Yeah.
Because they're all at a crazy level of ability, but actually the difference between them winning the major and not often is one mistake and a mental, missing that point. A lot of it comes down to they could do it like all day long, but the mentality.
Yeah.
So what does that look like? What do they come to you? What's sort of problem they come to? Or they don't have a problem, they're just trying to build upon. What does it look like in that world?
But so I think golf and tennis were probably the two biggest sports where they started to understand the mental game was the biggest part. And I was working with a 400-meter sprinter and then a 200-meter sprinter. And the 400-meter sprinter, we were just working together where she would do all the work, but when it got to competition, it didn't quite click and it didn't quite come together. So I was working with her to try and help her to start. I called it a mental logbook, where we'd start taking notes of how she was feeling, what was going on during training, and then so that she could start to understand what were the feelings and thoughts she was having as she got into competition. And then we used to use just like voice recordings where she would just leave me a WhatsApp voice recording. So that I was trying to get her to understand her stream of consciousness, that what she was saying to herself and how this was actually affecting her when it got to competition. And then we started working in pre-performance routine, I used to call it. Like, so you need to have a plan to like, what do you need to do? How do you need to start talking to your mind? How do you need to start tuning in so that when the gun goes or whatever, you're ready to deliver and ready to perform. And it was just working, trying to give her own toolkit so that when it came to competition, all that hard work came out and she was able to show that.
What's your kind of retort to people that would say to you, or maybe it doesn't happen, where they'll say, well, it's all well and good, the theory, whatever else, but you've never been a 400-meter sprinter, so you don't know what it's like. Does that actually really happen? Or do people respect the fact that, you're the mental fitness coach and that's your specialism? You don't need to know what it's like to be on the starting block type thing.
I don't know. Yeah, I suppose maybe I was always into sports, so I never got that. You've never played sports. I used to play, so I could but I know what you mean. And I'd always find a way when I'm talking. So I always talk about mindfulness. But if I like the first time I went to a boxing gym, I wouldn't just say, you guys come and sit down and be mindful. I would start to talk to them about what do you do after you've had a bad sparring session? You know, where do you go off to kind of give yourself space with your thoughts? What's the process you do? And then by asking them those kind of questions, trying to show to them how they are practicing mindfulness already and putting it in their own words. So I always try to find a way to relate it to them. But it's like that thing always comes up. I'm now a high performance leadership coach, and I get a lot of times where I work with executives, and people used to say, oh, to be an executive coach, you need to be an executive yourself, which I think is absolute nonsense. It's like, I just need to be able to see the potential in you and ask you the questions and take you kind of below, I call it below the surface, so that you can see the underlying emotions of what's happening. Like me telling you what to do in your job, that's not coaching. That's actually like a mentoring. So I always have to try and tell people the difference. Is like, you can be a coach, a good coach, even if you haven't done that particular thing. It does help that I have got corporate experience, because I find that I can then relate to people quicker and easier, because it's like I spent 20 years working in the corporate space. I know like the challenges and the politics and the things that go on, but I don't think it's necessary for me to coach someone.
Yeah, no, I get that. So you've done you did a bunch of sports clients, and then you shifted into the what you call high performance. Like, how did that kind of occur? Is it just more natural to you, as you were saying, because you're from that corporate background, or do you still do the sports stuff as well, or what was the switch?
It was having to be adaptive and agile, especially when I came to the US and the pandemic hit. So actually, when I first started, I was working with sports, and then I decided to go to the corporate space, because my wife was always like, why don't you go and work with people in the corporate space? But at the time when I'd left corporate, I was like, I don't want anything to do with it. I want to be as far away. So I decided to work with 3 friends. And I worked with those 3 friends who were actually going through transition periods. One of the friends, he actually showed me what good could look like, because the other 2 didn't go so well. But one of them, where we worked together, and up to today, he's still like, you know, he was able to make a transition. He was really successful at it. And he learned different things about himself, the way he reacts under pressure. So that kind of showed me, okay, what I do can work in that space. And then when I came over to the US and the pandemic hit, there was no sports at all. So sports kind of shut down. So I really had to adapt and like, okay, how can I use what I know to help other people? And then that's when I found 2 companies. One was called Valor, and they were taking performance psychology, but taking it into working with corporates. And then the other company was called Better Up, which again, just taking coaching to work with people. And during the pandemic, there was a huge need for it. So that was the way I just ended up adapting and bringing what I knew into a different arena.
So again, with like an executive that comes to you, or is it the company that sometimes refers someone, or how does it kind of come to be that, you know, is it a C-suite person generally of a bigger company? Like, and again, what sort of issues are they dealing with? Is it stress? Is it, how do they, you know, what sort of stuff is it that you kind of work on?
So usually it's like, I've worked with so many executives. So one executive I worked with kind of referred me to another leader who's the CEO of the company, and he wants me to work with people on communication. So I think a big part is people now have to get up and speak, and they have to speak to different groups, especially speaking through Zoom. It's quite different running a workshop or something on Zoom. So there's different skills that you need. So communication is one of them. Another one is people going through transitions, especially people who were really good at the job they did, and now all of a sudden they're now a leader. So they've now been promoted to a leadership role. Trying to help them hit that ground running and help them start to achieve results is something where I help with the mindset shift of what's now required for you to be a leader. How do you need to show up? How do you need to delegate stuff? How do you need to create vision and alignment and motivate people to get on board? But that's one of the things I definitely, I work with. And also people, so for instance, working parents who've gone off and they're now coming back into the working environment, helping them adapt to that coming back, and how do they show up now as a new parent in that role.
If you were giving, and we'll come on to your book in a second, quite a nice segue, but if you were giving kind of someone listening to this or watching this, like a couple of helpful tips as to maybe get a bit more out of their professional life, are there a couple of things, or is it more, it's case by case, or is there something that you generally see as an underpinning couple things that could, you know, they can work on, shall we say?
There's something I always talk about in my book, where I feel like if you want to sustain the high performance, we need to take care of your mental fitness first, so your well-being. So I always try to give people that tip where when I start off with, I always look at the person as an individual. How are they doing as a person with, how's the rest doing? How is their physical activity? How's their nutrition? And then once you take care of you as an individual, then we start looking at your different performance arena that you're working in. How do you want to show up as a leader? So how do you want to almost be a coach and encourage participation with the people you're leading? Or how do you want to show that vision and create that alignment? And how do you want to motivate the people? So they're kind of basic things we work on, but it can really be, it depends on what you're going through in your different performance arenas that would then dictate how the coaching works and what we do.
So something I work with a couple mentor, a few people, and one springs to mind where I noticed at the very beginning, and it's a question of interesting to know from yourself, where he has a very a public persona, right, where he's a community leader. But in his personal life, he's got some troubles, let's put it that way. And there's like a big dichotomy. So he almost has to be this like leader in one sense, but then his almost personal life is kind of left at home. Do you generally teach people and coach people that they need to find a way to bring themselves in? Or there's a certain amount of, yes, you need to do that, but you got to blend it with sometimes it's not appropriate to bring your troubles into work? Because I can see both sides of that coin.
I don't know about bring troubles into work, but I definitely found with the pandemic, you can't wear that suit anymore they used to wear when you go into work. Because for a lot of the people I was coaching, it's like, I'm looking into your house, so I can actually see stuff, what's going on. I can see you as a human being. And I think now when you show up as a leader, you do need to be authentic. So it's not really bringing your troubles to work, but you got to bring your full self. You can't just put a suit and tie on and pretend that you're now this superhero who doesn't have feelings or emotions. So I always find, definitely with all the leaders I've worked with recently, you do have to show up authentically, because if you don't, you're not going to create that psychological safety in your working environment for other people to show up authentically. And you're not going to be able to connect with the people to deal with, there's been so much craziness happening with so much uncertainty and change. And I feel like now you do really need to connect with people on a deeper level to get them to be able to keep adapting like you want them to adapt, so that you can perform, as a group together.
And where and how did you come up with this book? Was it just you wanted to condense your general philosophy into a guide for people to look at? Like, how did that come to be?
The book came out where I started doing my own kind of podcast during the pandemic, and it was a way just to keep in touch with friends back in the UK, where I was just talking about mental fitness. And I found like the more I talked to different people, the more I learned about how people were going through their challenges and how they were pivoting and adapting to things like homeschooling, remote working. And then as we came out of the pandemic, I started to just have it with normal people to just keep learning. What is it? How do you take care of your mental fitness, and what's something that surprised you about your mental fitness? And then last year, I kind of thought, okay, I've coached so many people during the pandemic, and for me, I like coaching definitely works, and coaching is definitely required now more than ever. So I was like, how can I put that in a story format that just connects with people? And that's why I decided to write the book. So, but I decided to focus on men because I found there was a few things that happened last year over here in the US. There was a high-profile DJ on the Ellen show who took his own life, and that kind of sparked a chord for me. Where I'm now in my 40s, mid-40s, and I had some friends who are now starting to have mental breakdowns, and I started to ask the question: why is it always? It seems to be men that this happens to. So I decided, okay, if I'm going to write a book, there's no book speaking to men. So I thought, let me create a story. So I created characters, but they're kind of characters, they're fictional and they're not fictional as well. But I didn't want to preach to people and say, go and do this. I wanted to just write a story, show people real life characters that this is what was happening, so that they can start to see what it means to have real talk. That's why I call it real conversations, where you show up vulnerably and share with each other. And then what does mental fitness mean? Like what can good look like if you're practicing mental fitness? And also there's a chapter in there, I call it Conversations with Morpheus, where I talk about how my self-talk, like you have to be able to talk to yourself first, so that when you show up, you can actually show up and share with others in a vulnerable way. So that's why I was trying to just start sparking that conversation and opening people's minds to mental fitness.
That's super interesting. I mean, you kind of mentioned it a bit in passing, but have you got any particular like client like success stories that maybe typify how coaching can be of value? Because I think a lot of people see and I never come across the term mental fitness before, but I quite like that as a term, as looking as a positive rather than mental health, where people perceive that as just some issue you've got, you know what I mean, negative, I guess. So I quite like that, to be honest. But have you got any kind of, client success stories in different arenas where there's certain fundamentals that you've instilled that have led them on to certain things? Reason I'm asking again is because I think a lot of people get the need for kind of performance coaching, but a lot of people think, is it just something you're paying for, and what actually do you get out of it, type thing?
Yeah. Yeah, and the mental fitness thing came out to me as well, where I think sometimes when we're talking about mental health, it's always a negative thing. And I'm trying to be proactive in that you have your mental well-being now, how can we look after it? And one client who is actually a bit in the book where I talk about where this person I got to work with, where they got really challenged during the pandemic, where there was a lot happening. They were managing teams, they were still having to go into work. And I got to coach with this person, and I got to see how they were pivoting and adapting and, changing and just supporting their people through the toughest challenges I could ever imagine. And it was quite nice. I was just holding that space for them. Every week it was somewhere where they could come, just download a stream of consciousness, and then actually just bounce ideas and actually see what was going on for their emotions. And I was hoping that was actually what was helping them get through. And I really saw this person shine during the pandemic, where they, all the tough things that happened on their team, they were able to bring their team together, and they were still performing really, really well. And then a big part that shocked me during our coaching journey was obviously person performing in that kind of conditions. Other people noticed it and said, right, we want to promote you to a senior, the top level that you can get in your company. And it was quite shocking to just watch this person start to crumble. And I was like, what the hell's going on? Like, all of a sudden they started doubting themselves, and they're like, oh no, everyone's going to find out that I'm not really good at what I do. And then it turns out there was something from their past of, a disability that they'd seen in themselves, where they said that they're not good enough to have this role. And then I had to start showing to the person, I've been working with you for the last 9 months, nearly a year. This is what you've done, like showing them this is what you've done. And this thing that you think is a disability is actually your superpower. That's the way you're able to be more creative, and you see things from different angles. And you also show up with more passion because you really care about what you do. So that person was then we were able to create some tools where they had their own pre-performance routine when they went for the interview, and they did the interview really well, and they got promoted. And to me, I think that's one of the biggest things for coaching is there wasn't any magic I did, but just having that safe space and that sounding board, so that at that critical moment where this person had worked for all their life, I was able to just say, no, this is like whatever you're telling yourself in your mind is not true. Like, this is what you've actually done, and that's why you're being put up for this position.
Does the coach have a coach?
100%. I have two coaches. So actually, how the book got written was because of my coach. So at the time last year, when I decided I was thinking about writing a book, I was about to become a dad for the second time.
Wow.
Said it to my coach, and my coach was like, yeah, you should write a book. And I thought, is this man crazy? Did he not hear that I'm about to become a dad? And then he was like, let's break it down. What's involved in writing a book? And then he went through the steps. Okay, the story creation, I think you can do that in 6 weeks. And I was like, are you sure? And he's like, yeah. So I went to go and speak to another friend who'd written a book, asked him what was involved. And the friend said, you got a phone, right? Just speak into your recorder for 15, 20 minutes, and that's a chapter. And then you always start with that. So transcribe it and start from there. And I just started going off for drives every morning after I dropped my kid off, and just go for a walk, to do a voice recording. Before I knew it, in 6 weeks, I had the kind of basis of a book.
It's awesome.
And then it's helped keeping me accountable. At each point in time, you'll always speak to this person, why don't ask me questions, and just held me accountable. And then before I knew it, my child was born and the book was there. So I've 100% think that if I hadn't had a coach, and he keeps saying this, he didn't write the book, but he did make me believe it was possible. And then he asked me what needed to be done, and then he just kept me accountable, and then I did it.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Talking of books and podcasts and these sorts of things, are there specific books, of course, other than your own, that you would recommend to people that are good for that kind of mental fitness piece, the way you've learned stuff from? Would you recommend anything?
Two books I would recommend. The first one is Jay Shetty's book, Think Like a Monk. I read that book and just really, really loved the book for the way it kind of talks about mindfulness, but brings it into everyday life so that it's not this thing where you just have to sit cross-legged for hours and hours. It's like he brings it into everyday life. This is how you can put it into your life, and this is what it means when you start to practice it. So to me, I love that book.
What would be something? How would you interpret that in your everyday life? How do you kind of do mindfulness in a proactive, modern way, I guess?
My one is like anything that you're doing that you really enjoy doing. So in the morning, I like to get up and just walk around the house, and we now have trees around, listening to the birds, the water before I start watering the plants, and just using that time to kind of check in with yourself and just think, okay, how am I feeling? What's going on with my thoughts? And then setting intentions for the day. So if it's people who have a dog, I don't have a dog, but if you're walking the dog, being a bit more intentional when you're doing it instead of just thinking about your to-do list, what you have to do. If you actually take that time to actually tune into like, what are my thoughts? What are the thoughts I'm having? How am I feeling? And then how do I want to engage with my thoughts for the rest of the day? I think that's a big part. So
Sure.
like little moments in the day where you can just take a breath. Like, I know it sounds crazy, but a lot of the clients I work with, when I just get them to just take 3 breaths, like count to 4, breathing out, it just stops that. I know you don't know when you start your day and you're so busy, you're just on autopilot. I got to get this done, got to get that done. You never
Yeah.
just stop. What am I doing? Like,
You mentioned something super interesting that I read it in Brene Brown's book. Brene Brown's book. There you go.
yeah,
Daring greatly. Oh, I've forgotten what it's blooming called. That's terrible. Anyhow, and it's actually she's paraphrased it from another book that I think is called The Soul of Money, and I don't know who that's by, but you can probably find out. And it talks about back to your client who didn't think they're good enough or whatever you want to say of
yeah,
the position. It's really interesting because we're in a society where scarcity is everywhere. So like, you know, she was saying like you wake up in the morning and a lot of people, the first thing you think of is, oh, I didn't get enough sleep. That's like it's instant. And then it's like instantly, oh, I've not got enough. Like it's always, I've not got enough. I've not got enough something in the fridge. Like, and it's just, you don't think about it, but like when someone puts it to you like that, like, yeah, so much of what we're thinking about is like not enough this and not like, and it perpetuates this idea from the very
yeah.
second you get up that you're already behind. Not enough time, not enough this, not enough that. Like, you know, and you do find people a lot like this, like not enough time today. This is, you know what I mean? Like you're constantly not enough in the
It's
bank
like
account.
something's chasing. It's like something's chasing you, and I kind of call it. That's the first voice that switches on when you wake up. It's like, oh, you didn't do this. Oh, you didn't do that. And
Yeah.
I try to break that voice because sometimes you think if you just tune into it, then you think that's you, and you just carry on doing what that voice is saying. But if you go out and you just start looking around, you try and listen to nature, and then switch it. It's like, what am I grateful for? All the
Yeah.
things that happen, switching from scarcity to abundance. What do I have? And it's crazy what it does to your mind when you're able to do that and not just let that, because there's
Yeah.
something I don't program inside of us where you got to do this, you got to do that. So you're always chasing for something. And if you can kind of separate from that voice and actually, what am I grateful for? And then set intentions.
Yeah.
That's
Well, it's funny because me personally, like prior to this call today, I had so many other things going on, and I in my mind I was like, oh, I could just message you and say, oh, let's postpone and do this. But I'm like, no, like I really enjoyed doing this. I know I'll get loads out of this personally and selfishly, which I did and have
yeah.
done. And but I know I always have that voice like before a meeting of someone first. I'm like, oh, do I really want to spend 15, 20 minutes talking to XYZ that I don't know when I can actually do? And I'm a watch trader by profession. So,
Yeah.
you know, in my business, it's a bit like being a stocks and shares broker. There's just constantly things flying in your desk all day, every day. The team send me a bunch of things. Everyone wants my attention everywhere. I've got 300 different businesses going on, all these different things. And then sometimes more frequent than not now, I'll just sit on my balcony. I'll just be like, I'm just gonna have a coffee and a cigar, and I'm just gonna sit here and I'm gonna just listen to some music or do nothing, and just for half an hour, and I literally zone out of all the noise. Everyone wants my
That's
attention.
mindfulness. That's
Yeah,
mindfulness what you're doing
yeah,
right there.
I do a lot of stuff which I'm not like coming to now because it's more about you than me, but that I've learned the hard way. So I haven't read loads of books about these sorts of things. I've just had to learn like, you know, the way I used to be, which was running around, chasing, like, you know,
Yeah,
but I also have the flip side, which is at the end of each day, and this is also mentioned in this book last night, or the phraseology, paraphrasing from the Soul of Money book about this scarcity built into our society. I do
yeah,
know that at the end of each day, it doesn't matter what I've done, I have this self-talk that happens where I'm like, "Ah, just didn't get enough done today. And it's inevitable, right?
yeah,
It used to really like just pee me off like no end. And these days I'm like, you know what? All that means is tomorrow I'm going to go again. Like that's how I turn it around. So like I have this kind of I think it's a very Buddhist approach of not trying to counteract, right? So whatever the emotion is, just feel it like it is what it is. If you're angry, pissed off, whatever, like, you know, because years ago, when I go back to my corporate career in Tesco, I was mentored by a really senior director. And she said something, if I use this as a good like little tool, and she said something, she's like, you know, Charles, like I can see you're gonna be successful, but like you need to keep yourself like in the middle. So you don't want to be too happy and you don't want to be too sad. You don't want to celebrate stuff too much, and you don't want to also be you know, angry and pissed off or upset by it, this, that, and the other. And for a decade, I would say, I was convinced that was the right approach. I was like, that sounds reasonable. Like you're in a top position, you're in
yeah,
a month what I earn a year. So it sounds like you probably know what you're doing. And then I went through my own personal mental health stuff and different bits and bobs, which is, you know, well known and whatnot. And then I slowly realized, and then Brene Brown talks about this as well, but I came to my own fruition, but she kind of cemented it that you as a human, you can't selectively minimize emotion. So if you say to yourself, well, I'm not going to feel stressed or pissed off or sad or angry or upset, you also then say, I can't feel happy properly and jubilant and joyous and everything. And it didn't dawn on me for a long, long time. And then I put that together with a bit of Mark Manson, So Long Not Giving a Fuck, which I didn't read. My ex-wife sent to me. That's probably why I didn't read it. But I saw his documentary on Netflix, and some of that resonated. And then coupled with Brene Brown of the you can't select to minimize emotion, coupled with the Buddhist approach of don't try and, you know, when you're feeling a certain way, the thing that makes you feel even worse and is counterproductive is trying to ask why every time and then trying to counteract that by distracting yourself or making yourself feel happy or whatever the case may be. So I kind of couple those three things together, and all of a sudden I'm like, all right, it's what it is. Like it'll go, it'll pass. You know, I woke up this morning and I was kind of like, I just don't feel great right now. But I was like, you know what? In probably half an hour, I'm sure I'll be fine. And you are,
yeah,
you're fine in half an hour. And then, you know, an hour and a half before this, I was absolutely exhausted because, as you probably can tell, I expel a lot of energy in what I do. So it's not the amount of hours I work, it's just the condensity of, you know, not
yeah,
to talk too much, but one of my old, again, ex-Tesco bosses, not the nicest guy, but what he said was very, very interesting. He was like, a lot of people are like a torch, right? So they got this light but share like spread across. But if you're a laser and you're super focused, you can actually break through things. And they're both the same thing. They're both light. One's condensed and one's focused, and one is not. I'm kind of like that. And the issue is if I don't control my energy levels, like I just flake and worse because of my kind of mentality.
There's a lot I want to unpack, which I love what you just
Go
said.
for it.
Shared. The first one is how we have to be proactive with our mental fitness. Because as you were saying, is like we usually wait for something to happen, then we learn about it. And then that's what I really want to change is like, don't wait till you kind of hit that wall and smash, because
Sure.
trying to put it back together, it's almost impossible. So I want to start being like, let's be proactive. If we have our mental fitness now, what do we need to do to maintain it?
Makes
What
sense.
things, that fill it up? And then I love what you just said as well at the end of the day, where well, I love the way your mindfulness, where you just kind of go out on the balcony, have a sip. But also at the end of the day, changing that, because that voice is always there. Oh, but you didn't do this, you didn't do that. And that's what I love with Jay Shetty's book, is like, we'll start to actually go through, what did you do? Like, start praising, what did you, because when you do that, you actually, it's a different mindset shift. You then start to realize, Jesus Christ, I did so much.
For sure.
But the mind tortures us by not looking at that point. And so if you can change that habit, that's why I try to change the habit in the morning. In the morning, I don't let that mind telling me that, oh my God, you've got this, I don't let that mind control me for the whole day. And then also trying to go to sleep. I'm not so good with the going to sleep one, but it's something I'm still working on, where just change yourself, change instead of what do I have to do? What did I accomplish is a big one.
So
and
Karen.
I love the thing you was talking about, Brene Brown, because I think she does come up with so many great things.
She's great.
Yeah.
She's
but
I find a lot, I do like a lot of the quote unquote life coach people. Again, it's a bit of, the term's a bit kind of overused, but a lot of them come across quite abrasive and like, very American. Let's go with that. Whereas her approach is more scholarly and like, here's what I learned. And like, I don't know, I look at it and I'm like, I identify more what she's saying than, yes, Tony Robbins is phenomenal. Like, he's a force of nature, there's no question. That fits certain people, but like Brene Brown, I think, is more of a, more relatable, shall we say?
Yeah. But Brene Brown actually was someone who helped me change my career. So the first time I watched her Netflix show, my mind was just blown. Where she's like, you've got to be vulnerable and you got to show up with authenticity. Because I never worked in anywhere where leaders actually showed that. And that's something I believe to my core. But whenever I try to show that, you get penalized for that because it's not part of the politics in the place.
What would be an example of what kind of thing would you try and do? Just be more genuine about what your thoughts were and things.
Yeah, like when you're in a meeting and you can clearly see, like, okay, this is actually what's going on. This is what's going to happen where we treat people. And you say it out loud and everyone's like, oh my God, what did you do? What's wrong with you?
Stepped out of line.
Yeah. And then everyone just dances around the subject and pretends that people are not going to get impacted by that decision. So that used to really kind of upset me, where like, we're just clearly not being authentic or not being vulnerable or saying, yeah. And then that's why there's no psychological safety, because there's always a game going on. So, and the point you just mentioned about energy management, it escaped from my head, because that's something that I work with a lot of people. And that's the premise of my mental fitness, is when you kind of apportion your day, I'm sure there's different parts of your day where you have more energy than not.
For sure.
And it's trying to work out what is your rhythm, where's the energy? And also when you put things in your day, what's going to give you energy? So it's like, I love what you said about this podcast. This podcast gives you energy.
Always.
So you need to, like, okay, if I'm going to do something where I have to talk with somebody for 20 minutes who I don't really like, I have to do it, but I know it's going to take my energy. Then you need to look at the rest of the day. Well, what's going to give you energy? Because you've got to fill up your energy tank. Because what happens is they just fill up the to-do list and they're like, I've got to go from 8 to 6 full pelt. It doesn't work like that. You're going to crash. You can't go full pelt. There's sometimes in the morning, I'm a morning person, so I know the first 2 hours, that's when I do the best work. So I have to protect that time and say, okay, the things I really need to get done today, that's what I'm going to do. Then take a break. Then other stuff, that you have to do, you can put in. But then I have to think, okay, that's going to deplete my energy. What's going to lift my energy up? And the Buddhist thing that you said, so I have this poem up here which helped me through all the tough periods I went through when I did the transition. It's by Rumi. It's called The Guest House. And I love what you said, where sometimes you can be feeling a bit down, a bit bad, but it's going to pass. It's like, it's just, let's say his son is like, your mind is like a guest house. Sometimes you have joy, they come through. Sometimes you have some sorrows that come through. But you have to treat each of them the same, because they're all bringing a message. But if you start trying to fight the sorrow, like, no, go, you're wasting your energy, because it's still coming through. So that one and when I was in the UK, I used to believe that don't be too joyous and don't be too sad. Always try and stay in the middle.
Yeah, it's probably an English corporate philosophy, actually.
Yeah, until I met my wife, and my wife is the opposite. She'll feel the joy and then crash. And I was like, how do you do that? But I agree with what Brene Brown has said, in that when you don't feel, if you always in the steady, you don't really feel the joy. And if you don't feel the joy, then you're missing out on so much. So you have to be able to feel all of them as much.
I literally not. This is just again that whole connecting dots going forwards, backwards, not forward, right? This was not in preparation for today in the slightest, but I was reading Brene Brown last night, and there was two things that came up. It's in the second chapter called Debunking the Vulnerability Myth. The first thing is, it says, yes, we are totally exposed when we are vulnerable. Yes, we're in a torture chamber that we call uncertainty. And yes, we're taking huge emotional risk when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. But there's no equation where taking risk, braving uncertainty, and opening ourselves up emotionally to emotional exposure equals weakness. That's the first thing. But the more powerful bit was this piece here, where she says, to feel is to be vulnerable. To believe vulnerability is a weakness is to believe that feeling is weakness. To foreclose on our emotional life out of a fear that the cost will be too high is to walk away from the very thing that gives purpose and meaning to living. I
100%.
I read that. I'm like, so resonate with that. Like, I talk about, because of what I do, I come across extremely wealthy people and all sorts of people, but tends to be, because it's luxury items, people at the upper echelons. And given my apprentice background, I've met a bunch of people as well and stuff. And I'm not saying this is a fact, it's just a theory. When you see people that are, I'm talking extremely wealthy, hundreds of millions, significant, but even maybe perhaps below, and they seem to not really ever be happy. They seem to always buy that next thing, go on the next holiday. Like they're constantly like trying to get this hit of dopamine, like kind of just spike it. And then you overlay the guys that we talked about of the Buddhist mentality, of the emotional range, of not minimizing emotions and all these things. I actually think what kind of happens in business is you maybe get so kind of hard nosed that you don't want to hear the negative, you don't want to hear about the stress, the aggravations, you're kind of sick and tired of it, particularly when you get to a success level. You just don't want to hear that anymore. You've probably got a team that handles all that, you just deal with other things. And then I think because you're like we were saying before, because you're then eradicating that as much as possible with your resources, whether it's your assistant, so you're not actually booking things, whatever it is, you're taking so much out of your mentality that all of a sudden you don't feel that low, any of the lows. So you actually can't feel the highs either. So then you're caught more and more in this middle ground where you're basically emotionally void. I think that's what happens. The more I think about it, I've not got any research that suggests that, but just anecdotally, it seems to me that's kind of what the issue is. And it is rare that you find someone that's financially free or successful that's also like just happy. It is quite a rare, weirdly. But again, people don't look at that. They think that's what it is. You get to that top of that mountain and that's it. You're good. And it's like, well, look how many people are financially free and aren't happy. That's the thing. And, from your background, I mean, I'm sure when you were growing up, there's plenty of people around that have very little but are happy. So that's clearly not the denominator of happiness.
I used to believe when I was young, before I met my wife, not when I was young, I used to believe that success used to breed unhappiness. But then now, especially what I've gone through recently, I feel like I know people who are successful and happy. Like if I think about the Barack Obama and Michelle Obama.
Did you say you thought success breeds unhappiness? Did you say?
Yeah, the more you went up, the more you were unsuccessful. Just the things you said, like you start to detach yourself from the lows and everything.
Right.
But recently, I've started to see people who are successful and they're happy. Like when I think Barack and Michelle Obama, whenever I hear them talk, they're definitely happy.
Yes.
Oprah Winfrey. So I started to realize it's not the success or it's not the money. It's like if you lose your intention of why was it you did that? What are you trying to do when you get successful? And if it's like for me now, it's like my family is like they're the thing that gives me the joy. And whenever I see them, that always gives me the joy. But also if you're working something that you're passionate about, I don't feel like if you don't lose your intentions of what you're doing, then the success doesn't mean that you're going to be unhappy.
Yes.
If you lose your purpose and your passion and you're just doing it just to win or whatever,
Yeah,
then you're going to be happy. So I don't think it's whether you're rich or you're poor.
agreed.
If you're actually sticking to your intentions, and also you have the things that really care about, that really bring you joy, which that's for different people is different thing. But for me, it's spending time with my family, and I always get to do that. So that always fills my cup with joy. So I feel it doesn't matter what the success, as long as I don't lose what the intention is of what I'm trying to do. And also getting to coach people, it's like, I never thought I'd get paid for it. So getting to do that where you're working with people, it always brings me joy. So I feel like, yeah, I don't feel it's the success or the money. I think it's if you lose sight of what your intention and your
Agreed.
passion is, then you're going to be unhappy.
No, I listen. I really agree with that, and yeah, I'm kind of on I guess, a bit of a crusade to prove that, for everything that I've been through and everything that people tell you, and people have this perception, I think, that you got to step on so many toes to get there, and you got to piss so many people off, and the only way you get extreme financial success is this. I'm like, I'm going to prove that's not the case. Like, it doesn't need to be that way. Like, I'd rather enjoy each day and take my time over it. I think it just takes experience and time to realize that. As ironic as that is, it's like,
And also meeting more people who believe what you believe. Because like before Brene Brown, I used to always think I had two heads, where all that vulnerability in. But now that she's got to where she's
yes,
then you actually think, my God, there is a different way of doing it. But the
yes,
problem is if you just went through, like when you were at Tesco and you just see those mentors who keep telling you, no, this is the way the world
so
is.
true.
Yeah. And then you're like, okay, that is the way the world is.
It's also super interesting now. I look back in hindsight, and as to that individual, for example, and I think actually their life was an absolute car crash, and I only realized that way later by their own
Yeah.
admission. I only realized that way later. And no, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat to you. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to kind of bring up, but it was just as I say, like, it's just to round off the conversation back to the energy piece. Like, literally before this call, I'm trying to negotiate on some partnership with another business, and my head's just like, it's just so much energy to try and figure out how do these two things align and all the rest of it. I was chatting to my marketing director trying to get this proposal over and yada yada yada. And I was like, oh, I could just so easily shoot this email saying, hey, can we whatever? And I'm like, no, like
I'm glad you didn't.
what's that? Sorry.
I'm so glad you didn't.
Me
I'm so
too.
glad.
I'm like, you know what? No, I absolutely love doing this. It's not a chore for me. It's something that, and you know what? It really not only is it educational, not only do I meet great people like yourself, but it just I don't know, I just love it so much. And it kind of I've just got back into doing this because I had a bit of a period where I was focusing on my business. And actually what I find is when doing this and other things, I do this mentoring piece as well with some other people. I think it makes you so much more rounded and better at everything when you actually take time out from the grind or the hustle, whatever you want to call it, of your day-to-day job, and go, actually, it's not taking time out. It's, as you're saying, it's like you're actually filling yourself up with more energy that assists you in that mental fitness, like back in the gym. It's like you gave me a really I love that that mental fitness thing. I'm going to really run with that. I like that a lot.
And I hope you keep that, because the problem is when you get into the grind, you think the grind is more important, but actually
It's not.
what you filled your energy tank is what you use to do the grind. And it's always, is remembering that.
No, listen, my day's gone from being, yes, listen, I do a lot of stuff every day, and probably by most people's standards, I think I live a week in a day and a month in a week, to be honest. But like this sort of thing just, really hits home. It's like my grandparents messaged me before they're back from holiday, do you want to come around for dinner? And I was just like, oh, I'm just like kind of, they're like, no, I am going, because that's the thing that when they eventually pass, which they will, if we're being honest, that you're going to go, why didn't I do that? I can't do that again. Like, I'm going to love being there and sharing dinner with them. And again, back to that energy thing that again, I never thought of. So I really thank you so much for the conversation. It's been wonderful.
Thank you so much, Charles. Yeah, I really, really enjoyed having this conversation with you. And I hope you keep up with your mental fitness. I've got an assessment as well on
Okay.
my website. So if you want to go on my website, it's a free
I'll give that a
assessment.
go for sure.
Yeah. I can send it to you afterwards, and would love to. If you ever wanted to talk anymore, I do this for a living, so I can talk about this all day.
That's awesome, man.
Been a pleasure having this chat with you. Thank you
Thanks
so much.
so much. And I wish you best for the rest of the day, and obviously have a nice weekend, and take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. 1 second. Let's just typically.